I'm very happy to greet all of you and to greet today's speaker. Today with us we have Boglárka Fedorkó. She comes from the Hungarian Association of Sex Workers. Roman Kuhar, he is a researcher and teacher at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ljubljana. He also works for the Peace Institute and for the NGO Legebitra. Luca Stevenson, he is the coordinator at the International Committee of the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe. And together with Luca, we actually designed this event. Actually, it wouldn't happen without him and the context. So I want to thank him very much for agreeing to this and for co-moderating with me the roundtable. And then we have Agata, Dziuban from Jagiellonian University in Poland. Agata also works for ICRSE and the association program STACJA in Poland. And we have Roxana Vasi with us. Roxana works for SWAN. It's the Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy network in Romania. You work in Romania at the moment?
Yes, I'm from Romania, but SWAN is working throughout all Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you very much to everybody. I would like to start this debate with a maybe broader question, placing the position of sex workers in the larger context of the regional developments. What we have been facing in the last years in Slovenian context and also wider are processes that could be understood as re-traditionalization of societies. We have seen in the last years the rise of conservatism, a rise of extremism, militarization of borders. We have seen rise of right-wing parties that are gaining more and more support in the parliaments across the region. We have seen the persistence of the Catholic Church and its so-called satellite associations that are briefly working against the human rights of LGBT community. And let me mention at this point that precisely these satellites in Slovenian context were the one that actually pushed against the legalization of same-sex marriage in Slovenian context. As you may have heard, at the referendum in December, the law fell precisely because of the activities of these associations. And at this point, let me mention that these very associations were actually also the ones in Slovenian context that 13 years ago, so in 2003, when prostitution in Slovenia was officially decriminalized, were the ones who proposed a referendum against decriminalization, but luckily it didn't happen. So we see this continuity of the rising conservatism that has real effect on many populations, LGBT, migrants, sex workers, one of them. And I would like to add to these trends also the militarization of borders and the restriction of free movement that we have been now seeing across the region in the context of the so-called refugee crisis. The Visegrad Group, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, including Slovenia, have been putting razor wires and have been putting the army to the borders. So we are seeing the militarization of the societies across the region. Of course, it's a wider European trend. So how does sex work actually fall into these wider trends, into this conservatism?
Yeah, referring to what Mojca was saying, definitely these are trends that, and I will talk about Poland mostly, I think, these are trends that are absolutely prevalent in Poland. So we have growing nationalism, growing patriotistic trends. We have anti-migrant sentiments in Poland. We don't have barbed wires at the borders yet, but I think Hungary is working well to stop all the people possibly flowing into Poland. But we have more and more restrictions on entry for people coming from Ukraine, for example, and most of migrant sex workers working in Poland are coming from Ukraine. So absolutely all these trends that you are mentioning are totally prevalent in the country and in the neighboring countries as well. And this is particularly worrying that we have also the so-called demographic crisis that is being brought up repeatedly, and a lot of focus on reproduction. So I would say that one of the trends that we also can recognize in contemporary Poland and maybe in neighboring country, I know it's a big issue, for example, in Russia as well, a huge debate around reproductive rights and kind of a backlash in reproductive rights, what actually has an impact on sex work policies as well. Like in Poland, not yet, because sex work is too taboo subject to bring up, but for now, because Poland is really a Catholic country, so there are some topics that are not really being discussed. But for example, more restrictions on abortion in Poland right now. They are discussing this new law which will prohibit any form of abortion under any conditions. So for now, for example, we have a period of 12 weeks when abortion can be performed under 3 conditions. So rape, threat to mother's health, and some malfunctions like abnormalities in the fetus. So these are the 3 conditions under which abortion can be performed in Poland, though very frequently it's not, because there is a closure of cautious that doctors refer to, and they sabotage the procedures for women who actually want to get them. But right now the law proposal that will actually take away this very few opportunities for women to have an abortion will probably pass, given the Conservative Party has a strong majority in the parliament. But this is a trend which like it's kind of important, I think, when we talk about sex work policies in the region as well, because like question of demography and the demographic crisis, as they usually call it, is usually related with some kind of promotion of family, so-called family values. So negative attitudes toward same-sex relationships as well. In Poland, we don't even have referendums on these controversial issues, for example, same-sex partnerships, because these are too controversial. So this definitely has, it's maybe not shaping policies right now in Poland, because as I've said, there are no debates around sex work policies, but they are increasing stigma against sex workers as non-reproductive, like people who engage in non-reproductive sex and are a threat to family values, whatever that means. So.
Just to refer back to the refugee crisis, I think even before this happened, sex workers throughout Europe, migrant sex workers, were a group already affected by anti-migrant policies, especially through the mainstream anti-trafficking discourses who target us. But to refer more also to the context of Romania, there is also this very populist, nationalist, very conservative Christian Orthodox trend, and currently it's not even a talk about same-sex partnership or whatever, but there's a push for a referendum to introduce this clause in the constitution that family is composed by woman and the man, which is already present in Poland or Hungary or other constitutions.
Croatia.
Yeah, and together with that, actually, the same groups are working both on anti-choice, anti-abortion policies and on anti-sex work policies. So it's the same core group working on all these areas.
I would like to say something. I would like to say something more specific about these movements that you were talking about. These are anti-gender movements, and this is also the main frame that somehow unites these different voices and different actors that emerge not only in Eastern Europe but also Western Europe. And this is an interesting trend, so we cannot limit this phenomena only to post-socialist countries but also to the Western part of Europe. What was going on in France around marriage equality legislation is an example of that, but we've seen these kind of trends also and these kind of movements now being very active in Italy, for example, also in Spain and elsewhere. And what is the element that unites them is this concept that they came up with of gender theory or gender ideology, as it is called in some cases. Sometimes they call it gender theory, sometimes they say gender ideology. Now there is no gender theory as such, right? It's a made-up concept. But what is striking to me is that this boring academic-sounding term, gender theory, has this huge mobilization power. I've seen pictures from Poland, for example, where they are holding these signs, "Stop Gender." People that didn't, study sociology or gender studies or anything like that, but this gender is now becoming, or has become, an empty signifier in terms of you can fill it in with just any topic. And some of these issues were already mentioned, starting with marriage equality, but it goes far beyond LGBT issues. Women's reproductive rights. Most generally, I would say it deals with it deals with sexual citizenship or intimate citizenship issues. Going back, tracing the beginnings of these movements, it is quite interesting that the first mentioning of the term emerged in documents issued by Vatican in mid-90s after this International Women's Conference. And slowly, but quite successfully, they managed to create this gender as a tool, as a mobilizing tool, as a weapon that they are now using. And it is interesting how the term has now become a reality. For example, the French Minister of Education claimed that there is no gender theory taught in French schools, as if there is gender theory. We had the same situation in Slovenia with Legebitra. Around one of the two referendums, there were these claims that children are being brainwashed in schools by gender theory, and then eventually the Minister of Education said that everything was okay and there was no gender theory in schools and so forth. The demographic element was already mentioned. I would also like to mention another element, and these are children. The well-being of children is one of their major frames. And it is not surprising that back in 2003, when we have a debate about decriminalization of prostitution, this was also the frame that was used at the time. One of the arguments from the leader of this initiative, but I wouldn't say that this is the same. I wouldn't say that at the time it was already the anti-gender movement. These are phenomena that we see in terms of going against what feminism in any shape or form is agitating for or aiming at. But these are they are now using new techniques and new approaches. And one of them is that they are the change in the discourse. And the change in the discourse is going into more scientific sounding discourse. They are now quoting sociological, psychological studies and so forth, but making it, but using the words in a sense that they have this populist effect. And for now, it was mostly marriage equality and reproductive rights of women, but I'm sure sex work is one of the next topics on their agenda, because it falls out of the picture that they want to impose on this world, and that's the picture of a heteronormative family life where sexuality is, limited to reproduction and pretty much stigmatized and not talked about and so forth.
Would love to say that I can't contribute anything with anything else because you said it all, but coming from Hungary, unfortunately I can. So, like talking about migration, I mean, Orbán was the first politician, I think, in a EU state to thematize like this widely the whole migration situation, and like a lot of countries following that took kind of like his policy approach to migration. I also wanted to address this anti-gender movement that is becoming stronger in Hungary, at least as far as I perceive it. And it's also interesting because I think in the very beginning, or when it became like kind of like mainstream discourse, it was not that much related to women, not sex workers at all, but to trans people, which was kind of like the first appearance of trans people in public or policy discourses, and this was especially on the occasion of Conchita Wurst winning the Eurovision, so it's kind of like an interesting story, how people jumped on that. But just like some practical implications that are arising from all these trends that you have been mentioning. So I don't know if you have heard about this like big witch hunt on Hungarian NGOs by the Hungarian state. So basically a couple of years ago, like 10-15 organizations were basically blacklisted by the government, and including the sex worker organization as well. So there was kind of like a government-fueled propaganda initiated against these organizations, and these organizations, of course, are LGBT, women's rights, liberal parties, young groups, or like those who are addressing social marginalization with a rights-based approach, I would say. So sex workers so far haven't been addressed in public discourses under this anti-gender theory, but like it has like really practical implications for funding, for instance, on sex workers. So it's not just a theory, but like also they already face the implications on the ground. So apart from this like really big backlash on all these NGOs and representations of marginalized populations or social groups, what we also see is that they're really overusing the misdemeanor law to punish like populations across the whole spectrum who are from one way or another marginalized. So Hungary is as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only country who is punishing homeless in its constitution in the word. So basically it's illegal to live on the street. And also the misdemeanor law was amended in 2012, and basically it allows for imprisonment of anyone based on like public ordinances. And this is especially used to target sex workers, street sex workers. So in 2012 there were 14,000 misdemeanor cases initiated against sex workers, 14,000 individual cases. So not that much happening on like theorizing this whole anti-gender agenda within the government. Some politicians, yeah, of course have statements, but it's more like really using the legal measures to promote these really punitive approaches.
If I can add a word. So I would like to respond to what you both said, because I think it's very interesting, but shows that this is not only about sexual citizenship, this is about citizenship in general, how it is being redefined constantly those days, and how the normativity is being redefined at the same time, criminalizing the most vulnerable, like constant criminalization of the most vulnerable communities within our society. This is a trend we can observe across Europe, I think, and actually the refugee crisis is showing perfectly like how people are another groups of people are being considered as not fitting or not entitled to any kind of norms. And actually the different states of emergency that raise all across Europe constantly, which enable the governments to define another groups of people whose rights are not being to be respected actually in the letter of the law. So I think that this is like a broader process which refers to citizenship in general. And for example, this very nationalistic trends in many countries across Europe, countries which are pretty homogenic actually in terms of presence of ethnic minorities, etc. Like Poland is totally like non-migrant welcome country, and there are, like, I would say I've never seen that homogeneous country in my life, and it's always surprising to me. And actually, still we are totally, like, Poles are totally anti-Semitic, like Islamophobic, and there is this like fear, constant fear that is being discussed in the media, that is being actually triggered by the media, of the other that is going to come, and the other, like the category of the other is actually broadening constantly. So the homeless is the other already. Somebody who is not normative in terms of gender roles is the other. So I think that for sex workers to become the other, and it's pretty easy, not talking about the fact that actually sex workers usually come from these different marginalized communities already. So, for example, Roma sex workers in Hungary, Ukrainian sex workers in for example, Poland, or the mythical Eastern European sex workers anywhere, because this is the discourse we hear constantly, the mythical Eastern European sex workers who just...
Yeah, just to add that, I think there is also this danger that any Eastern European woman, migrant, is potentially considered a sex worker. And this whole process of othering, getting so much, what's the word? Sorry, bigger within our region, it's still part of a whole process of Eastern Europeans, Balkans, whatever, considered semi-barbarians, European others.
And actually, just to add one word to that, about considering any Eastern European as a potential sex worker. So in Sweden, they have this practice that if you are traveling to Stockholm through Skavasta airport and you have ID, and you have condoms with you, more than 3, and you have a passport showing that you are from any Central Eastern European country, you might be actually not let into Sweden based on an assumption that you intend to sell sexual services there, even though selling sexual services in Sweden is not illegal. So this is a practice that has been reported many times, actually.
I just wanted to make a few comments, and like Roxana was saying, that one of the big issues that sex workers have been facing is like the conflation of migration for sex work and trafficking. And what we're seeing now is that, for example, like the EU is trying to broaden this vague conception of trafficking to actually any refugee. So there was a discussion at the EU level that we should criminalize anyone smuggling or helping, refugees cross the border. For example, like any NGO or any civilian, supporting a refugee arriving on like Lesbos Island, for example, because these people would be then considered traffickers. And that's something that the sex worker movement have been like fighting for many, many years, and we've been denouncing that like the majority of sex workers, migrant sex workers, are not victims of trafficking. They are people who've made a decision to work in the sex industry and to cross borders, and yes, might be exploited in on the process, etc. And I think that really reflects on like how governments are, on the fence on like, are these people victims or criminals? And like they can't openly say that like, refugees are criminals. Also like the common discourse is like, the refugees are not really refugees, they're economic migrants, they're like illegally crossing the borders, etc. But it's the same thing with sex workers. Sex workers are always, are they victims or are they criminals, and how should we treat them? There's more and more discourse that like all sex workers are victims, we should criminalize clients, and these poor people should be, saved from themselves sometimes. But actually, when you look at the response to that, it's not really a victim approach to sex work. It's still considering sex workers as criminals, and there's always a form of like indirect criminalization of sex work. And I think that the link between like refugee and sex workers is quite apparent. And I feel like we talk a lot about like the conservatism and like religious groups and the impact they have on like on minority as well. But one of the main obstacles sex workers have faced when trying to fight for their rights is that actually, and I think we're the only group where like conservative religious group have found the best allies in part of the women's rights movement. So in France, where I live, I'm from, for example, and like in many other countries, one of the most like visible example was like the Femen, the Femen organization, who is, for example, in France was interrupting a mass, for example, and throwing, fake blood at religious groups, for reproductive rights, but then also interrupted like sex workers, and calling for like the abolition of the sex industry. So the three main aim would be, if I remember right, like the three main issue were, patriarchy, capitalism, and the sex industry, and it's seen as like, sex workers are one of the main things to fight against. And that's like suddenly an area where the most conservative groups, the most anti-woman organizations suddenly finalize with part of the women's rights movement. And the problem is that we see now, like in Serbia or Lithuania, where clients of sex workers are being criminalized, and often it's under the pretense of gender equality. It's like, well, prostitution is a form of violence against women, and we need to protect these women, therefore we should criminalize clients like they did so successfully in Sweden. But they don't actually decriminalize sex workers, neither in Serbia nor in Lithuania. And the result is basically pure criminalization of all part of the sex industry. I think that's how like the discourse can, between like what discourse is and what the reality is often like the same with the refugees, etc.
Okay, you've opened many issues. Perhaps now we go more in depth into some of the things that you mentioned. The last, so Luca's comment on, maybe broader comment on the allies in terms of sex workers movement. So you mentioned some women NGOs actually not working with the movement, but working against the movement. On the other hand, we have Amnesty International, so the importance of some of the national and international movements that are actually supportive of sex workers' rights. So I would like to reflect you in the region, in the countries of the region, how these alliances are shaped, what are the problems, and what are also the stories of good collaboration in these terms.
I think we are in a lucky situation in Hungary because we are like having like really broad partnerships with a lot of organizations. Of course, there's 2 or 3 really radical feminist organizations who are totally opposing our agenda, and we are not really managing to find any common ground. But my kind of like general observation is, and maybe it's also applicable to Europe to some extent, is that it's really a class-based issue, this whole alliance finding. So we cannot say, like generally LGBT or trans organizations are sex worker supportive. I think like usually it's like a hierarchy, like organizations mainly addressing issues of MSM, men having sex with men or gay people who have a long tradition and pushing for marriage equality, for instance, because they are in that part of that segment of society, they usually leave behind sex worker issues. And that's why, like because of the class differences, for instance, between, it's a generalization of course, but from my experience in Hungary, I can say that like LGBT organizations where a lot of gay men are advocating for certain changes, sometimes they are not as much supportive of sex workers as trans organizations who are representing sometimes those people who are like in really marginalized position in society and really excluded from everything. So so it's still, I think we cannot really give a definitive answer to that, whether the European LGBT movement or like local LGBT movements are really supportive. I think one of the like most common alliances in the region is between health service providers and or social work providers and sex work organizations. So actually those people who are in touch daily with people in the sex industry, especially like street sex workers, they absolutely understand the reality and the potential consequences of client criminalization or any kind of regressive model. So our HIV organizations on board. So I think this is kind of like the general setup for Europe, and it's also the same in Hungary.
In Poland we are also lucky, I would say, mostly because for different reasons there was not enough time for feminist women's organizations to actually internalize the abolitionist framework. Abolitionist meaning anti-sex work and like treating sex workers as victims and promoting clients' criminalization. So in Poland this framework is not that popular, and it's not that known within women's and feminist organizations, except for those that are in some way entangled within European institutions. so work in different European Union and European Commission working groups, for example. So we are working in a way on a virgin ground where there is no much debate around sex work. So we have a space to actually create alliances. Another observation I have from the last few months is actually the fact that we have very oppressive conservative government right now, which is also targeting gender, which is constraining public debate and making some things undisputable in a way in the public sphere. We have like a lot of fear within NGOs and governmental organizations and community organizations that they will be suppressed and we will have like a Hungarian scenario. So there is more space for building alliances actually. So different organizations are more open to communicate, to try to find a common ground on that controversial issues as sex work, for example. So recently ICRSE with different women's and feminist organizations launched a feminist manifesto in support of the rights of sex workers. And actually we had a chance to convince at least 8 or 9 different organizations, mostly women organizations in Poland, to sign this letter. I think it wouldn't be possible during the Hannibal campaign in 2014 because 3 organizations signed at that time. And so I think it's a good thing, and also we can see that there is a lot of alliance building happening on the European level, which is reflected also on the level of our local alliances. So, for example, transgender rights movement is pro-sex workers' rights in general, at least the European one. So trans rights organizations in Poland are also supportive of sex workers' rights, even though they don't have direct contact with sex workers, they don't work with sex workers. But being within the movement, being within the frame of this discourse around sex work is already beneficial in these terms. Same, I would say, with LGBT organizations in Poland. So if they are entangled in some broader European movements which are pro-sex workers' rights, or if they have any kind of connection with sex worker community, then they are for sex workers' rights. Also, when we think about the situation in Poland, there important issue is issue of migration. So, so I would say that the organizations that are focused on migration are divided. If they're organizations like women's organizations focus on migration and they are connected to European institutions, they are abolitionists. But if these are organizations, again, as Boglárka said, working on the ground, having connection with sex workers themselves, then they would promote sex workers' rights. Maybe not promote officially, but they won't be abolitionists, because promoting sex workers' rights in Poland is not the most popular thing to do. And another possible platform for alliance building, as Boglárka said as well, is within the health sector. So there are different organizations that are focusing on HIV, I guess this is a common trend in Europe, that the HIV epidemic and response to HIV epidemic is becoming more and more biomedicalized. So most funding is channeled to treatment and to post-exposure, and recently, unfortunately, also to pre-exposure prophylactics. So treating people who are not living with HIV yet, just in case. So this is this new medical strategies, medical prevention technologies actually consume a lot of money. Big pharma is taking care of that for sure, and in result there is no funding for HIV prevention whatsoever. And this is a situation when different key populations and organizations representing different key populations, so men having sex with men, people in prison contexts and situations, transgender people, sex workers, and different migrant groups that don't have access to mainstream public healthcare services, because this is another issue that's really affecting sex workers, that they are migrants very frequently, so they don't have access to any state-provided services. So this is a space also for alliance building for us. So all these groups are being kind of left over by the state, left behind, and states are often really withdrawing from their responsibilities for these specific communities. So this is a space where we actually can kind of come together and try to work on finding opportunities for providing the most marginalized, frequently overlapping communities. I should mention people who use drugs as well, of course. These different communities with HIV prevention.
It's funny, in the context of Romania, I was speaking about this fascist Orthodox groups. They have these blogs on sex work where they cite feminist texts, abolitionist feminist texts without actually indicating the source. So I found EVL, European Women's Lobby material, some texts written by feminists in Romanian. And yeah, there is a very big abolitionist trend within feminist organizations in Romania, unfortunately, and that in the context of until last year sex work being criminalized, punished by prison, now it's just an administrative fine, and alarming high rates of police abuse happening within that context. So me too, I would say the only support sex workers are currently getting are from only two harm reduction organizations, but otherwise it's pretty bleak.
Yeah, just to briefly add, the Slovenian situation is similar to the situation in Slovenia in terms of not having any outreach programs or not having any NGOs, although there are several NGOs working on gender and on gender issues. So apart from NGO that is Create Society fighting against trafficking, there is no outreach work taken up by any NGOs. And at this point I would like to bring into the debate the role of SWAN and ICRSE in terms of being an international, SWAN also the regional actor actually working on the ground. And if you can reflect both on your experiences in initiating initiatives in the region. For example, we talked before about your work in Bosnia, for example. So there are societies in the region, in the Balkan region, where actually we know very little about the situation of sex workers, having also no alliances in the NGO sector. So where does your work come in here?
But just for a little background and for clarification, the name of the organization is ICRSE. Nobody can remember it, so it's okay. And it's a network of Slovenian, sorry, so I should say it's a network of around 80 organizations, either sex worker led, so led by sex workers, or working directly with sex workers or service providers, and around 150 individual members all over Europe and Central Asia. And we try to work at different levels, often depending on the limited funding that's available for sex worker advocacy group. Both working at the kind of more like policy level, at the European level, so trying, for example, like monitor or campaign against resolution that are like, not pro-sex workers' rights at the European Parliament, or try to work with allies such as ILGA, the International Lesbian and Gay Association, or Transgender Europe, try to like build awareness about sex workers' rights in like different groups which would be seen as progressive. So, for example, with PICUM, the platform of international cooperation on undocumented migrants. We also do campaigns, like we campaigned last year in support of Amnesty International, etc. And then we are like a platform of communication between all the groups in the region as well. Of course, it's very difficult due to like language obstacle. So we managed to share some information between groups. And then finally, we try to work on the ground with sex worker organization. So in the recent years, we've been doing capacity building trainings on sex work, HIV, and human rights in different countries in the region. One example, we did trainings in Romania, in Turkey, in Macedonia, in France, etc. And what we're trying to both support sex worker-led organizations that already exist, but also try to foster mobilization of sex workers in countries where there is little sex worker movement. So for example, in Romania, Roxana and I were facilitating a training of 5 days with like 22 sex workers with Carousel, the local service provider, harm reduction organization that is a member of both ICRSE and SWAN. And it was the first time that 22 sex workers were coming together for a week, learning about the legal system, learning about the different legal frameworks around the world, like decriminalization, meeting with the lawyer, talking about activism, how to mobilize for your rights. It was quite a challenging event, but I think it felt also like really exciting that regional network to be like really supportive of sex workers on the ground, and it actually led to sex workers writing like letters of complaint to the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Health about violations that they are receiving when they're trying to get treatment in hospitals or when they are being abused or like raped by the police. And this led, so we wrote like letters with sex workers giving their testimonies and sent to the 2 ministers, and it led to the police actually contacting Carousel and setting up a meeting to discuss how to change this. Of course, that might just be like one meeting between like one police officer, but already that's like an active change that we're like quite happy about. I don't know.
Yes, SWAN, which, as I told you, works only in Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia, was funded 10 years ago more in the idea to address the context of post-socialist Eastern Bloc countries. We do a lot of advocacy, but then it becomes so hard because especially the influence of Russia within the region is very, very strong on the Orthodox groups, and there are a whole lot of laws, even if in countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where sex work can even be considered decriminalized in the sense that it's not punished, there are laws actually targeting sex workers, be it residence laws, or of course the anti-gay propaganda thing, which is kind of spreading around together with, in Central Asia now, fundamentalist Islamist groups coming up. So there's a very high level of violence, and that's why we have recently tried as much as possible to focus our resources on having workshops with sex workers, for sex workers, on responses to violence, advocacy, and so on. But it's kind of depressing. Yeah, I'm not a pessimist.
A very good team, because I'm an optimist, a pessimist, so it's important. But I mean, that's why like, having like the backup of a group like Amnesty International, I think is going to be really huge for the sex worker movement. Of course, it doesn't mean that suddenly all Amnesty International branches at the national level are going to take on sex workers' rights. It's still down to like each country to decide if that's, but we're hoping that it's becoming more like a mainstream issue and people will realize that like the only way to address violence against sex workers, and it's the first step, is to decriminalize sex work so that sex workers are able to report violence. Around the world, like the majority of violence that sex workers are suffering from is often from the police itself, or like immigration control, etc. Like when we talk about violence of sex workers, like the police is one of the main, actors, and even in country where sex work, where the police might not be like directly attacking sex workers will not report violence because they do not trust the police. Because even if sex work is not criminalized, maybe they are working illegally in the country, or like illegally, maybe they are undocumented, maybe they are sex worker drug users, or they might be like, falling under, in the UK for example, like if 2 sex workers work together, then they can be arrested for brothel keeping. And that's a thing that's all across the region as well. Like the pimping laws are usually targeting more sex workers than evil pimps. Like there are laws about coercion, trafficking, exploitation that sex workers could use to take their exploiter to court, but this is not happening because sex workers themselves are criminalized under like a brothel keeping or third parties law. So we're hoping that Amnesty, and we actually already see that like in the region, some Amnesty International branches are coming to us and we're like, well, actually we didn't really have a clue about sex work, it's not really something we discussed. We were kind of thinking the Swedish model seems to be a good thing, and now we're coming to you to try to understand better how to support sex workers' rights, so that's quite exciting.
Yeah, but then in the same time you have some authorities in some states that really don't give 2 cents about all these human rights mechanisms, and it's very little you can actually do, at least with that tool. But it's funny how the image of sex workers in Eastern Europe is so much constructive and them being passive and victimized. But then when it's people are so much accustomed to repression from the state, it's very hard. I mean, you have to carefully calculate your risk when you actually want to respond in any way. If you can actually report violence from the same perpetrator who is enacting violence upon you. So there are vicious circles, and the ways people refer to sex workers are not most of the times fair in taking into consideration or all the obstacles of the state.
If I can just add one word, because as Roxana said, many states won't take into consideration recommendation provided, for example, by Amnesty International, or they won't really listen to the UN agencies or a World Health Organization suggesting that the criminalization of sex work is actually the must-do if we want to protect this population in terms of health and their well-being and safety, given the levels of violence just mentioned. So maybe to fit into this pessimist-optimist continuum here, we have to be realistic that this change is not possible in many countries right now across the region, but I think what we can do is to try to build alliances between different community groups, between different movements, like for example women's movement, as we mentioned before, but also labor movement, because as Luca was saying, sex workers are facing exploitation, like labor exploitation while working, and different unjust, unfair workplace practices. But they won't be able to redress and access justice in this respect as long as their engagement in sex work won't be recognized as work. So maybe this is not that easy on a legal level, but at least gaining support and recognition from labor movement and labor organizations, trade organizations, with respect to work would be a thing. Because, for example, we know the case from Argentina where sex work was not legally recognized as work yet, but still sex workers gained recognition by the labor movement and actually were supported by the labor movement in their struggle for the legal recognition. So there are also different overlapping communities. We talked about trans rights organizations. We talked about LGBT organization, other queer collectives, for example. There is not a space yet for revolution in the legal terms, but there is a lot to be done that can be done, even given the really hostile environments we function in right now, to a migrant rights movement, of course, to change perceptions on the ground within the civil society, within the different actors that in a way might have an impact on shaping policy when the nationalists will kind of disappear from this region in 15 years, maybe. So I wouldn't be optimistic saying there will be a legal change in the region very soon, but I would say there is a lot to do, and building alliances and supporting sex workers' community self-determination in the region. This is very, very important.
You've tackled several issues again, which is nice. If we go perhaps now more into the discussion about work, so the work part of sex work. Of course, it reflects the legal frameworks in the countries. We've seen bogus employment, self-employment, precarious employment. You mentioned that we should think about sex work in relation to precarious work in general. I think migrant work and similar. So if you can reflect so the work part of work in the region.
Well, I think there's often a misunderstanding, and I think sometimes I'm not even sure using the word sex work is the most useful, because it is often misunderstood. I think sometimes willingly misunderstood by people who don't want to support sex workers' rights. Like when we say that sex work is work, it doesn't mean that we like doing our work, or that we think that it's a good job, or that we think that it's a career option, etc. I think it's often misrepresented, like when the sex worker movement is often described as like, oh, it's only like a privileged few who've chosen their work, they don't represent the majority of victims who didn't have a choice, who are trafficked, who are drug users, who are coerced, etc. Like, I think there's a really problematic way of understanding sex work, which actually is really simple. Like when you exchange, you exchange an activity for remuneration, and often in sex work it's directly money, but it can also be, you know, housing or drugs or food, like depending, like if it's survival sex work, for example. This is what we understand as work. It's an activity, it's like an economic activity that allows us to survive, like any other work in, you know, in the society. And it often is precarious work. It's often a job that is available for people who have very limited options. So like we're talking about undocumented migrants who can't have a contract with, you know, a more like a regular, like in the regular economy. With trans women, for example, in Turkey, the very large majority of trans women work as sex workers because they will not be employed in any kind of other type of employment. And sex work is one of the only options. But it is definitely work. This is how they pay for their rent, for their food, for their surgery, etc. This is the work that's available for them and that they are doing. And I think there's really a problem with abolitionist organizations who refuse to hear that part of our discourse. They say, as long as you define as work, then we can't agree. We can't, like, I've been invited to debate with the European women lobby, and they just refuse to sit at the table because they see prostitution as a form of violence against women, denying the existence of men working in the sex industry, and probably denying like the existence of trans people as well. And I think like this area is really problematic. Like we need to be able to talk with abolitionists and have this understanding that many people in the sex worker rights movement believe that lots of people in the sex industry shouldn't be working as sex workers. There should be more option for everyone, not to be, I wouldn't say forced, like not to have the only option, but to be working in the sex industry. I think that's a common goal between many like feminist organizations and sex workers' rights organizations. But I think there's a willful misunderstanding between like the two parties. But I feel like, yeah, I will just stop that over too much. Sorry.
I can say something on the basis of one small-scale research that Mojca and I did a few years ago on male sex workers in Slovenia. And it is quite interesting that among our respondents there was basically two groups, and one group was referring to, none of them was using the term sex work to start with, but there was a group of sex workers who described their work as work, and they described it as a career decision. That these are the exact words that they were using. And when we were talking about how they work and what is important, they were talking about how much they invest in the advertisement of their services. So in that sense, I mean, the correlation to work and what is otherwise correlated to work, and in terms of advertisements and in terms of promoting and stuff like that, it is basically the same. I remember one respondent who invested a lot of time and probably money into his body. He said, I go to fitness 3 times or 4 times a week because that will improve my selling points, basically. On the other hand, there were a few who were more, describing their own experiences in terms of entering into sex work just by accident as a mean to find a way out of disturbing socio-economic situation that they were in. But the problem probably in Slovenia is that none of them somehow talked about the need of organizing or fighting for the rights or recognizing this as a work. Despite the fact that we could see, at least in this small-scale research, that it is a work.
So, but you're talking about like legal frameworks. I think maybe we can mention that with Agata and Roxana. So in Hungary, sex workers have to be self-employed, and that's the only employment relationship that is available for sex workers. And actually this push for kind of like having legal opportunities for employment was not coming from the sex worker community at all, because it was a criminalized setting, so people like didn't really think about getting this to this distance, but it was coming from the tax authority. So there was quite a landmark case of the tax authority suing 15 street sex workers based on tax avoidance, because according to the law on sex work, prostitution is illegal in Hungary. So this is how it came into being, like 10 years ago, I think. And still, I think the whole approach of society is centered around this to quite a large extent. I don't know if it's good or bad, but like people, I think in general, like the majority of people, at least those we hear, are thinking about sex work as a form of employment, as a form of work, and emphasize that sex workers need to pay their taxes as much as any other citizens. I think it's, yeah, it's one stance on it, but like what generally sex workers are saying is, yeah, we definitely would like to be employed as well, because like for instance being self-employed doesn't allow for trade unions, like they can unionize in these employment relationships. And of course we would like really, we are really keen on organizing and paying taxes as well after the whole sex industry is decriminalized. So this is kind of the discourse in Hungary right now. So people are, what we are saying with the Hungarian sex worker organizations, yes, that sex workers are paying tax. Yes, absolutely.
It's very similar here.
Yes, some do because they have to take a loan and they cannot, they have to access social benefits. It's still a really small minority who are self-employed actually. And then again, like in brothels or any kind of settings, you are working being self-employed, so there is like no any kind of contractual agreement between the employer and the employee, so that's again like a really big obstacle to Hungarian sex workers, I think.
So in Poland it's a bit trickier because sex workers are not allowed to pay taxes. So there in sex work provisions it states very clearly that this kind of activity is not to be taxed at all. Why? Because of our law on sex work, which says that third parties should be criminalized. So when profiting from sex workers, then the state becomes a pimp. So sex workers are actually totally prevented from paying taxes and all the benefits that might follow. So social benefits, pension benefits, etc. And this is in a way, some would say, like in Polish society, there is this like spread opinion, shared opinion, that sex workers are just parasites who actually earn money and like unlike all the other citizens don't have to pay taxes. But many sex workers actually would like to have this kind of opportunity because lack of ability to pay taxes on their work means that they don't have medical insurance, for example. So sex workers are in these terms in very precarious situation, and this is another very important kind of element of the debate within sex worker movement, like the workers' rights and labor recognition that sex workers very frequently don't have because of criminalization of sex workers settings. So for example, even in this legal context where sex workers are not being punished for selling sexual services themselves, but third parties are being punished. So rural managers, owners, the agents, be it male and female, because we also should kind of counter this very stereotypical representation of the pimp. Different people might be actually performing this role, which we traditionally call pimping. So a lot of sex workers work in organized settings where there's somebody who is, for example, arranging they're facilitating their, for example, meetings with clients, or is taking care of the premise, etc. And in this situation, like when third parties are criminalized, sex workers themselves are not doing anything that's illegal, but actually their work settings already criminalized. And when sex workers' work settings are criminalized, they are not able to enter any kind of employment relationship because somebody who is employing them is actually not legally recognized. Like this is a criminal, basically. And this results in very precarious working conditions for sex workers again, because sex workers don't have any kind of employment contracts in most of the countries where third parties are criminalized, which means that they don't have collective bargaining power, so they can't form, for example, trade unions. They are not able to access any kind of provisions that other workers have. Privileged workers who have employment contracts. This is not that popular in Europe anymore. Actually, a lot of people work in very precarious conditions, and actually, sex worker situation in a way reflects this precariousness. This is kind of parallel to what's happening to a lot of migrant workers, etc. So then there is no space for these employment contracts for sex workers, and in many countries, sex workers must work on self-employment. And this is also another precarious form of work, actually, self-employment, we have to admit it. But there are in other countries, like Poland, for example, where sex workers are deprived of this possibility as well, being on self-employment. So they operate in this totally gray zone with totally no protection, and with this like constant discursive discourse around sex work, saying that sex workers are parasites because they don't pay taxes. But people don't really reflect on the fact that sex workers might be willing to pay taxes to get these different benefits, but this is like legally impossible. And that the criminalization of their workplaces might be a precondition for actually giving them tax obligations and benefits.
I mean, just to be now the less optimist in the room, but I think there's also like the issue of stigma, even if even the majority now of sex workers are self-employed. If this was possible to change, very few sex workers would agree to have a contract with their real names, with a manager or a brothel owner. And there's been like research, like for example, women working in strip clubs, I think it was in the UK. What kind of, like there's been big cases in the US, for example, where like strippers have taken their bosses to court because they said actually it's an employment contract, like I have to work from this hour to this hour, I have to perform this routine, I'm not self-employed, I'm an employee for many years, I should get all these benefits, etc. And they won the court cases in some cases. But then when research showed that actually like the majority of like strippers were not interested in having a contract because of the stigma, because they're afraid of like where this information will go. And for sex workers it's the same, like very few sex workers would agree to have their name, like the legal name on a document. And so we're a bit like stuck in this situation, like on one point, like sex workers can only be self-employed if they can be self-employed at all. But on the other hand, because of stigma, I'm not sure that suddenly like they would be able to have contracts and then benefit from the same social benefits as other workers. So it's a really tricky one. But that's one of the main issues sex workers face, is like the many sex workers don't have any access to, I don't know, sick days, sick leaves, or pensions, for example. In many countries, sex workers continue working in more and more precarious conditions past like the 50, 60-year-old, like 70-year-old, etc. And of course, like by like reducing their rate, having less clients, engaging in more risky behavior, etc. So that's definitely a big issue for the sex worker rights movement, but that is really difficult to find a solution. And that's why we're also like pushing to work with trade unions, because we believe trade unions in many places have been failing some of the most precarious workers, including self-employed people. Like there's a really big increase of self-employment in all the countries because of like changes due to austerity measures, etc. Like, and the trade union movement needs to catch up with this. Like how do you organize self-employed people who work from home, etc. So hopefully there'll be more debate between like the labor movement and the sex worker rights movement.